Welcome to World History and the West. The topic for this week is the Victorian Era. As you progress through the material of the week, keep in mind the following central question. Did the developments of the Victorian Era lay the groundwork for future conflict or contribute towards positive progress? The Victorian Era. The Victorian Era would encompass conflict, national unification, industrialization, cultural progress, and the growth of ideology. Nation-states like Germany and Italy would soon form. Industrialization would transform production, the workplace, and further national wealth. Liberalism, conservatism, and nationalism would be joined by the introduction of communism. Lecture context. Where? All of Europe. When? 1848 to 1900. Lecture topics: the rise of Britain, growth of ideologies, industrialization, and the development of the nation-state. The central question of the week. Did the developments of the Victorian era lay the groundwork for future conflict or contribute towards positive progress? The broader picture. The Victorian era followed the post-Napoleonic era and coincided with industrialization and new imperialism. New imperialism focused on the scramble for Africa from 1885 to 1914. Industrialization. Starting in 1830s Britain, the Industrial Revolution transformed how products were produced. The development of various technologies allowed products to be produced in mass quantity by machines rather than by hand. This revolution would also transform communication, transportation, and rural to urban demographics. Britain would be the first to industrialize. This would create competition between European nations. The German state Prussia also industrialized quickly, and as a result was more advanced than other European nations. Russia and the Ottoman Empire were far behind in terms of industrialization and would have to catch up. Urbanization. Although industrialization transformed access to products and increased national wealth, it also posed challenges, namely child labor, poor working conditions, environmental degradation, corporate corruption, and disorganized urbanization. Families moved en masse to the cities for employment opportunities, and in order to survive, they needed all family members to work, even young children. Children would often work in the textile mills, getting into small spaces which were more difficult for adults. Rivers and canals became polluted with industrial waste dumped into them. Workers had few rights and really few other options in life. This resulted in an abuse of power by corporate elites. This abuse of power gave rise to the development of the ideology of Marxism. Karl Marx thought the communist revolution would first begin in Britain, but instead it began in Russia in 1917. Queen Victoria and Britain. Queen Victoria would serve as Queen of Britain from 1837 to 1901. Under her rule, the British Empire expanded greatly. The nation industrialized and Britain became the most dominant world power. Despite these advances, Victoria's reign would also be marked by the growth of poverty, conflict within the empire, and legacies of colonization. Following the Indian Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, in which the British regained control of India, Queen Victoria was also given the title of Empress of India. The rise of nation-states. The division between conservative and liberal elements within Europe continued. In 1848, nationalism joined the ideological picture. By 1871, the process of consolidation and unification had created modern Germany and Italy, altering the balance of power within Europe, also known as the Concert of Europe. European nations also continued their quest for colonies. This became known as New Imperialism. This New Imperialism focused on establishing European colonies within the continent of Africa from 1885 to 1914, and was driven by the need for new resources that could be used for industrialization. European nations sought to dominate their colonies politically and economically. The scramble for Africa. As mentioned previously, the need for more resources drove Europeans to colonize Africa. The French and the British would become the most dominant European powers within the region. Newly formed Germany and Italy attempted to catch up quickly by also gaining colonies. This competition for colonies would later be a factor in the start of World War I. Nationalism and liberalism. Although very different in their beliefs, these ideologies did cooperate with one another during the revolutions of 1848. This was an odd marriage. Nationalism. The idea of nationalism linked the individual's identity with that of the state, connecting its sense of pride and power with the internal and external strength of the nation. Liberalism. Liberals realized that they needed a military force to accomplish their objectives and institute their beliefs. It's important to note that present-day conservatism is not the same as conservatism of this era. Conservatives of this era were not supporters of democracy, but rather more traditional forms of government, like a monarchy, which provided stability and order for society. Liberalism of this era is actually known as classical liberalism. Revolutions in Europe from 1830 to 1848. 1848 was the most revolutionary year in European history. The revolutions pitted the status quo against new liberal movements. Some questions to consider. Were any regions spared? And what regions were hit the hardest? France, 1848. King Louis Philippe, also known as the Citizen King, and his ministers represented the middle and upper classes of France. Republicans opposed his rule. It's important to know that Republicans believed that a monarchy should not exist. King Louis Philippe made political meetings illegal. As a result, the Republicans instead held banquets in order to discuss their ideas. King Louis called in the army, but they refused to fire on the Republicans. The outcome? King Louis was overthrown and a provisional Republican government was set up. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Within several months, workers in France mounted a second revolution after the cancellation of national workshops. National workshops were work projects for the unemployed. Known as the June Days, France descended into a short civil war. Riots started, but this time the army supported the new provisional government made up of liberals, socialists, and nationalists. Elections were held in December of 1848, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was elected as president. He was the nephew of the original Napoleon. He later centralized power around himself and declared himself emperor. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. France was no longer a monarchy. Napoleon III ruled as president from 1848 to 1852, and as Emperor Napoleon III from 1852 to 1870. Initially under Napoleon III, the economy was prosperous, as the boom in railroad construction had a multiplier effect that stimulated French industries and generated employment. He also created the Crédit Mobilier, an investment trust in which citizens deposited savings, which in turn financed industrial development. A series of scandals would also cloud his time in office. His rule would come to an end following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. During the rule of Napoleon III, the French populace seemed somewhat uninterested in democracy. The Franco-Prussian War. Prussia's overwhelming victory over France in 1870-1871 brought down Napoleon III and France. It resulted in the creation of modern Germany as the most dominant power within Central Europe. Britain still remained the most dominant naval power. On December 1 and 2, 1871, the army occupied Paris, and the police arrested 78 National Assembly deputies. The army killed 200 rioters while suppressing a left-wing uprising in Paris. The unification of German states. From 1815 to 1848, liberal nationalists dreamed of the creation of a unified Germany under a liberal constitution. However, there were significant political obstacles, most notably religion. Many northern German states were Protestant, while southern German states tended to be Catholic. The German Confederation of 1815 brought together 39 states, including the larger and more powerful states of Prussia and Austria. The purpose of the Confederation was not to unite German states, but to preserve the existing political structure following the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. Unification of German states continued. There are two key definitions to remember: Greater Germans and Lesser Germans. Greater Germans were those who favored the inclusion of Austria and were drawn largely from the southern Catholic regions. Lesser Germans were those who favored the exclusion of Austria and looked instead to Prussia for leadership. They were drawn largely from northern Protestant areas. In 1834, customs agreements brought the northern states, including Prussia, but excluding Austria, into a closer economic association. Otto von Bismarck. Appointed First Minister by Kaiser Wilhelm or King Wilhelm I in 1862, Bismarck desired to unify many German states. He believed that Prussia should take the lead in the unification process. He pursued a policy of reality or realpolitik. This was a very pragmatic foreign policy that included the use of war to create greater cooperation amongst German states. To force German states to work together, he triggered a war with Austria in 1866 and established key alliances with other European countries. The 7 Weeks' War. Bismarck succeeded in defeating the Austrians. German states no longer looked to Austria for leadership, but instead to Prussia. In 1867, the North German Confederation was established, uniting 22 of the 39 German states. Neighboring France was watching and worrying following these developments. The balance of power in Europe was changing. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870. After a dispute between the two countries revolving around the appointment of the new Spanish monarch, France attacked Prussia. War started in July of 1870 and ended in September with the defeat of Napoleon III. German troops had reached Paris and forced an unfavorable treaty on France that resulted in the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine becoming German territory. Following the war, the southern German states joined the Northern Confederacy, with the exception of Austria. The German Empire replaced France as the most dominant power within continental Europe. The Paris Commune. The French had been defeated. Revolution was attempted again, however. Napoleon III fled to Britain, and the communards, who were democratic socialists, rioted within Paris. Government troops entered the city and killed 20,000 communards. Order was finally restored, and France continued as a republic. The unification of Italy. From 1859 to 1866, the Italian states went through the process of unification. Unification was led by the region of Piedmont. Camillo de Cavour, Prime Minister of Piedmont, took the lead. All the Italian states would be unified, with the exception of the Vatican City under King Victor Emmanuel II. The Pope would refuse to recognize the unification of Italy until 1927. Conclusions. Much change and development would occur between 1848 and the turn of the new century. New nations would unify, Britain would solidify its power, while Germany would emerge as the strongest power in continental Europe. Industrialization and new technologies would transform how people lived and worked. All of these developments would contribute to the further development of the West.